Lawyers of Reddit. What are some of the most hilarious, absurd, ridiculous things you've seen in someone's will? Story 1 had a guy be extremely charitable when we were drafting his will. $1 million to his church, $2 million to a local hospital, another $2 million to the American Heart Association. When we gave him a quote on how much it cost to draft the will, it wasn't much, because it was a rather straightforward document. He asked for a payment plan. He couldn't afford the will. Dude had no money. He thought you could just leave money to people, organizations, and the government would foot the bill. He was also the sort that became visibly angry talking about welfare and government handouts, which made his thinking even funnier to me. Story 2, I remember reading about a fellow who wrote, "And to person X I leave 50 cents, with which he should buy a good, stout rope to hang himself with, and thus rid the world of his wretched existence." Edit, guys, this was a long time ago. Yes, a rope today costs more than 50 cents, I know. Shut up about it. Story 3, my professor just said that he had someone in the early 80s that left his 3 sons and grandsons his extensive baseball card collection. It seemed normal when my professor first heard of it, but then he was handed a handwritten chart that had several hundred cards listed with the name of the recipient and why that person was getting the card. I leave this picture to Bobby, because Bobby can't throw worth a. Story 4 did a few pro bono wills up on the reservation. This big guy asked me to give everything back to the tribe because he has no living immediate family. No problem. Then he has one exception, his Vietnam-era motorcycle. Said it was the first thing he bought after getting home. Wants to be buried with it. I should clarify, not with it, literally on it and in riding position. I helped him set aside the funds necessary to do it and have a lot prepaid for. Dude was awesome. Story 5, a client had 2 sons. He left a whole bunch of specific distributions. To one of the sons his truck, gun collection, etc. To the other son, he specifically left one thing, a poster of himself in high school. No idea if there was some significant sentimental value behind the poster, or if it was more of a look at what I'm giving your brother and hey, erase a poster of me, so you will never forget that I loved you less. Story 6, in law school, I once read about the great Stuart Derby, an eccentric wealthy Toronto businessman and lawyer in the 20s left the bulk of his estate to the woman who could have the most kids in the decade following his death. The courts upheld the clause, and eventually 4 women split the inheritance with 9 kids each. He also left a bunch of other crazy terms, including a vacation home in Jamaica, to 3 people who hated each other under the terms that they had to live in the estate indefinitely and brewery stocks, to teetotaling ministers if they participated in its management. Story 7, in ELB, but read about a New York heiress who died in her 90s and named her 2 grandchildren in her will, meaning they showed up for the reading. Actually, what was written in her will was, "And to my grandchildren X, and Y leave nothing, for reasons that are known to them. For reasons that are known to you them." Ice cold. Story 8, obligatory, not a lawyer, but I heard this story from a woman who used to work at a funeral parlor. Apparently, there was this rich old broad ROB from here on out, and her family had been waiting for her to die for a bunch of years so they could get her money. Real stuck-up, shitty people, and ROB hated them. But I guess she either didn't have anyone else to leave her money to, or she figured that her awful family would contest the will if everything wasn't left to them. Knowing how status-conscious these shitty relatives are, ROB decided, fine, they can have his stupid money, but we're going to make him suffer for it. So when ROB finally passes away, her lawyer approaches the family with her instructions for how her funeral is to be run. According to ROBs, well, the only way they get the money is if they follow these instructions to the letter. I don't remember all the absurd details in her instructions. Been a few years since I heard the story, except for the pièce de resistance. ROB required an open casket funeral with all family members in attendance, and demanded that her corpse be dressed up like Bozo the Clown, makeup, red nose, crazy hair, massive shoes, the works. The family tried to protest, but ROB's lawyer had tied this thing up beautifully, perfectly ironclad. They either attended the Bozo the Clown funeral, or they don't get a dime, so they did it. These stuck-up had to stand there for hours, glowering, taking weird looks from all their friends' neighbors as people got close to the casket and realized ROB was dressed like a clown. According to funeral parlor employee who had dressed ROB and applied the makeup, the best part of the service came when they tried to shut the casket, and couldn't because the massive shoes got in the way. They had to bend these 24-inch shoes in half to get the lid closed. I never had the honor of meeting the brilliant cantankerous old, but she's one of my biggest heroes. TLDR, if you want to close a casket when the corpse is wearing clown shoes, you have to bend the shoes in half. Story 9, not a lawyer, but my SO's father was, and he always said his favorite story was of this old money lady he knew of. She was worth around 15 mil and had 5 kids, one of whom married a horrible man who would spout just the foulest against anyone that wasn't a white, rich, able-bodied Christian male. When she died, each child got $3 million, Except for the piss baby's wife, she donated that money to things like HBCUs, Planned Parenthood, the Special Olympics, her local synagogue, food banks, etc., because you both deserve to die penniless and hating each other for being awful human beings. Story 10. Filthy Rich Man was the owner of 2 pet ferrets at the time of his death. He loved these ferrets and wanted to ensure that these ferrets were taken care of when he passed, so informed his sons that the ferrets were to receive all of his property. Story 11. My mom only works for crazy rich people. The worst will she ever told me about was this old guy who was close to 90. He wanted it so that when he dies, all of his millions will go into a trust for his kids, and his kids will never be able to touch it, but they can collect the interest it generates. So he had my mom set him up with this group of accountants who will manage the trust, and he specifically arranged a plan with them to manage the account in such a way that their yearly billing will almost exactly match the interest to be made. So when he dies, his kids will inherit millions, but will only be able to spend like $35 a year from it. $35 that the kids have to split between them. Story 12. 54-year-old, very wealthy, no children, not married, left his 6-month-old at the time of drafting nephew a 1980 Lamborghini Countach LP 4000S. Had no idea. Had to Google it. It is expensive. Story 13. Not a lawyer, but my mom had her will updated to say that if me or my brother announce her death on Facebook, then we are out of it. It sounds kind of harsh, but me and my brother think it is hilarious. She did it because she doesn't give about Facebook, but all her friends do, and they keep pestering her to get one, and she thinks it's tacky to announce a death on there. Story 14. Obligatory. Not a lawyer, but I can answer this one. My grandpa left $1 to my piece of thief of a dad with the instructions to shove up his. I haven't personally seen the will, so I don't know if this is true or not, but he was a World War II vet in total, so I believe it 100. Story 15. My dad teases my brother and I that his will has a stipulation that he be cremated and his ashes baked into a loaf of bread, and that my brother and I have to eat said loaf of bread to qualify for any inheritance. The scary thing is my dad is a lawyer who writes wills. Story 16. Not a lawyer, but my dad was sick and he knew he wouldn't be around for much longer, and he wanted his will to be done. He was a super practical joker and always told us that when he died, he wanted to be cremated and his ashes put in the pepper pots at Wimpy. So the lawyer is taking the notes and asked what he wanted done when he passed away. I froze and looked at him, and he had the biggest smile ever and just said he'd like to be cremated. I was so relieved. We both had such a good laugh about it afterwards, and he said he'd never have made me do it. Gosh, I miss him so much. Edit OH wow, gold. Thank you, kind stranger. What a great start of the day, XXX. Story 17. My grandpa originally had just 2 grandkids, my brother 17 and I 22. He has a collection of nice cars. Originally, I was getting his 2 Corvettes and my brother was getting his Cadillac and a race car, while my aunt and uncle finally coughed up some kids, and my mom is about to have another baby. So now there's 8 grandkids. He's announced that he will be having a contest for the cars. The contest is to make him an apple pie that tastes just like his mother's. Story 18. My uncle wanted to 1. Be cremated, 2. Mix the ashes in a gunpowder, 3. The gunpowder put into bullets, 4. Half the bullets shot in the general direction of his homeland in Asia, 5. The other half distributed with a lottery system based on which people listed in his will have the most guns, 6. Most of his money given to the bearers of the bullets. 7. The bullets must be fired within a year or we lost the money. Yeah, he liked guns. Story 19. Not a lawyer, but have done plenty of internships vacation schemes. Favorite has to be woman who had fallen out massively with her daughter because she hated the husband that the daughter had chosen. This feud went on for years to the point where they never had any contact, and whenever they did, things would just get pretty ugly, with the daughter refusing to leave the husband and the mother demanding that she did. So when the time came to read the will, it turned out that the mother had left a good portion of money to the daughter, 10/20 of the sizable estate. There were 3 or 4 children, on the sole condition that the daughter change her surname and her children's surname back to her maiden name, effectively removing this hated husband's name significance on their family tree. By the sounds of it, this was a real sticking point for the daughter, and I was at the law firm whilst this whole saga was going on. The solicitors were pretty confident that the daughter was going to forsake her inheritance, which was a pretty large one, in order to keep her husband's name. Story 20. Not a lawyer, but a law clerk. I draft the wills. My personal favorite bequest was elephants go to the grandchildren, largest to smallest. Do the largest elephants go to the largest grandchildren? Also, are these real elephants or elephant statues or something? I'm still not really sure what they meant by that. Story 21. Not a lawyer, but my grandmother left my father out of her will, and by extension, me and my sister. She always been an angry person. Her only form of affection is buying people things when it comes to interaction with the family. It's been nothing but insults and negativity. We're all stupid. We're all worthless. Why can't we be more like such and such kids and so on? My father moved our family across the country, and one of the biggest reasons was to be closer to her. We visit her all the time, call her all the time. And then several months ago, my grandmother told my father that he's cut out of her will and that she's already started transferring her assets to his brother. She supposedly had a lot of things to say about my dad, my stepmom, me and my sister about how we don't care about her, and that we're so bad to her. Ever since then, we hardly even speak to her. This looks bad, you know? If you tell someone no, I don't speak to my 90-year-old grandmother anymore, the one who has always bought me gifts, that sounds awful, doesn't it? I think she did that on purpose. I really do, because why else would she even say anything? She had no obligation to tell anyone. She wanted to cause problems. Now my father is the bad son, and now my sister and I are the ungrateful grandchildren. Not only that, but my uncle, the one who is going to receive her assets, is such a coward that he hasn't even spoken to us either. Doesn't answer calls. Nothing. We don't see our aunt. We don't get to see her cousins anymore. It's a shame. Everything was fine until she decided to break up the family. Story 22, my since passed aunt and uncle rode up right before my uncle died. I was about 3 at the time, and maybe meet my uncle a handful of times. Fast forward 15 years, my aunt passes with the same will, and half my family goes to settles all the affairs. Weeks later, I overhear my mom on the phone talking about the will. It was set up that I get 50 of all assets, plus the house and any cars, while everyone else 8 or 9 people get the other 50. But I also receive controlling factor, giving me the right to settle any arguments between everyone else. I was about 3 when this was written, but my uncle said that there was something special about me and deemed I should get 50. Sadly, there was nothing left because it was used on my aunt's end of life care. To me, it wasn't the money. I could really care less. Just the fact that I barely knew my uncle, but he liked me so much he wrote me in like that, and that my aunt agreed with him and didn't touch his will. Story 23, this guy's will wasn't notable, but his medical power of attorney gives someone the power to make medical decisions on your behalf. If you are unable, got pretty interesting. He wanted to instruct his agent to arrange a lesbian show for his viewing pleasure on his deathbed. I told him it probably wouldn't be enforceable, and instead wrote a provision requesting, but not requiring, that the agent arrange for strippers to perform for him. But no or other physical contact. He eventually changed his mind about the whole thing. He had just divorced his wife, and I think he merely wanted her off, knowing that she would probably see it. Story 24. So my dad just died. He left me his only child, a shitty old car worth about $1,000. We were close, and I spoke to him at least every fortnight and drove the 3 hours to see him as often as I could. He was difficult, paranoid, and suspicious. I was patient, loving, and as helpful as I could be. He left his entire property to charity. In going through all the paperwork and trying to find out why, I've worked out the timing of when he changed it and realized that he changed it after my wedding because I had my mother, who raised me and paid for the wedding sign, the wedding certificate, instead of him. I hadn't even known he wanted to. He never asked. He mentioned it months later, and I apologized and said that I would have been happy to let him do that if I had known he wanted to. He said, "But fathers are supposed to sign the wedding certificate. If I didn't sign it, you must not believe I am your father." I have no idea where he got that idea from. I explained that it could be any witness, and ISNE is something fathers traditionally do. I thought he understood. Apparently not. Apparently he was still so put out that he took me out of his will over something so petty, and after everything I did for him. I should be mourning his death now and missing my father, but instead I'm furious and raging. It's not about the money. It feels like a massive final slap in the face. You, Dad, I loved you and looked out for you when no one else would, and this is what you do to me. A man who wanted his cremated remains to be sprinkled on the crotches of well-endowed teenage boys. I have assumed it was some kind of joke. I mean, how would his heirs even make that happen? He had died, and I was just determining the ownership of his former real estate, so I didn't ask. Story 25, I'm not a lawyer, but when I was in college, someone died and left money to the college, and in the will it said, "I don't care what you do with the money. Throw the kids an ice cream party or something," and that is exactly what the money was used for. They threw a gigantic ice cream party. Story 26, an ALB, but was the executor of a family member's estate. The most satisfying part was the hateful S-gel of the deceased, who was initially in the will, but she had gotten the deceased to drastically increase her amount by cutting out my immediate family members while he was in the hospital before major surgery. Once he recovered from surgery, he redrafted and wrote her out. Story 27, this woman left Charles Bronson a good bit of money, which he apparently showed up to get. Admittedly, I believe he donated a lot of it to charity. Story 28, man, have I seen some bad ones recently. Had this little old lady come in, a referral from one of our clients who was an accountant. He said she was a little bit strange, but nothing too odd. Lady had 4 children. Her husband had passed. had a couple of $100,000 in various bank accounts plus a house. So she appoints her friend as executor and trustee, with the direction to sell her house when she dies. A sizable portion of her estate was to go to some weird church. The balance of her estate is to be invested and used to house her 3 little dogs or any dogs that she has at her death, with the direction that her trustee look after the dogs. Those dogs are going to be much more wealthy than myself in a couple of years. Story 29. I remember a case from law school that was used to teach the concept of the holographic will, wherein a dude was run over by his own tractor and pinned to the ground. He was able to scratch his will into the paint on the tractor's fender, and it held up in court. Story 30. My uncle left instruction for the burial plot next to his to be kept and maintained for the eventual burial of his widow, my aunt. I always thought that was incredibly presumptuous of him. He was older, and she was still an attractive middle-aged woman. When he died, she got married 2 more times. In fact, both of those husbands died too. Story 31. Not a lawyer, but a coworker of mine has it in his will that before he is cremated, he is to be wrapped in bacon. He has no family and a lot of money, and this dude loves bacon. He said it's going to cost somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500 to be cremated in bacon, but totally worth it to him. Story 32. My husband joked that if I die before him, he's going to have me cremated and my ashes turned into a gem. I'm going to put it in my will, so he has to have it done. I told him that I should put in my will that if he were to ever remarry, then my gem has to be a part of his new wife's engagement or wedding ring. And if they divorce, then I go back to him. I will never let him get rid of me, lol. Story 33. Obligatory and not a lawyer, but I know the guy who did this. My dad's his accountant, and I keep having to meet him for some reason. His dad left him the family business, which wasn't worth masses, but it was still a nice amount. The will stated that if he sold it, 1/3 of its value had to go to each of his 2 sisters. Well, the business started booming after a little while, and the business was then worth millions. The guy sold the business and gave his sisters 1/3 of what it was worth. He hired some lawyers to deal with his sisters when they tried to get 1/3 of its current value. But because of the wording in the will, he won. The guy then just invested and owns ridiculous amounts of land. He's bought whole fields just so he has somewhere away from people to have a picnic with his significantly younger wife. Story 34. Not a lawyer, but my father-in-law was assigned to be executor of a will from a rich aunt. She left, per her will, 95 of her stuff, which was quite a lot, to a Children with Cancer Foundation, noble cause, but there was no foundation with that name. Now he had to find a worthy cause that would basically fulfill the deceased aunt's will, which was a FING nightmare. Story 35. Not a lawyer, and it may not even be true since it was in a legal advice post, but a few months ago this guy was posting his parents' will in which they wanted all of their assets liquidated, sold for cash, and then have all of the cash burned. Story 36. My dad's will says his middle finger is to be preserved to start a clone army, and his ashes are to be shot out of a cannon by his childhood best friend. Story 37. Not a lawyer. I do title for oil and gas leasing. This lady in the turn of the century left her husband enough money for a bottle of whiskey, and because that's all he ever wanted anyway. Also had a will that stipulated all of his slaves to be freed. Subsequently, there were recorded deeds conveying freedom to a black husband and wife. That one hit me hard. Story 38. Off topic, but when I was 14, I found my dad's will for when he was going to commit suicide. Nothing was out of the ordinary, but he left 5 buckets of dog to my uncle. Lovely family I have. Story 39. If I was rich, my will would just be a bunch of insults to everyone. After I died, there would be a large gathering of everyone who thought they were getting something while a lawyer just read off the list, like a reverse roast. Story 40. I once was asked to put a stipulation in a woman's will that her dog be put down and buried with her once she dies. I was really uncomfortable and discussed with my boss. In the end, my boss told me to do it. Dogs are personal property, and she gets to decide what is done with her personal property after death. I thought this was pretty cold-blooded and made me sad for her pet. She was fairly young still, in her 70s and in good health, so my hopes were that the dog passed away before she did. In the end, had one of my colleagues draft it who didn't have such an affinity for dogs. Story 41. Anyelby, my great-aunt, had a detailed will, left specific furniture, family heirlooms, etc. to specific people, left her house to her favorite nephew. She had never married or had kids, but it turned out she didn't own the house, and it instead belonged to a Catholic priest, one that she had been having a relationship with for 3 decades. The favorite nephew got nothing. Story 42. Not a lawyer, but in my will, which I was forced to make at a young age due to deaths in the family and an inheritance I have set up so that none of my limbs may ever be amputated. I have a morbid phobia of amputation deformed limbs, and I can't hear about it, see it, or be around people with it without extreme mental preparation. So I'm sure if my lawyer saw this thread, he would post it so I guess I'm posting on his behalf. Story 43 sister used to work for a nonprofit in Philly that was frequently the recipient of bequests from wealthy estates. The nonprofit has been around for at least 200 years, and they have some really odd bequests still kicking around. One she mentioned they were left a sum of money each year from an estate, so long as they arranged to ship a set of books to Liberia each year. The head of estate was an abolitionist, and he wanted to help the ex-slaves in the new-at-the-time country of Liberia get started. For a good stretch in the late 80s and 90s, though, no one would deliver to Liberia thanks to its civil war. So someone from the foundation had to hop over to Africa and hand-deliver a box of books to a war zone in order to keep the bequest happy. The particularly annoying part was that it wasn't a lot of money, 150 a year or whatever it was a huge bequest in, say, 1815, but these days it doesn't go far towards transporting things to Africa. She spent a lot of time making presentations asking people not to do things like that. Story 44, as odd as this may sound, I hope to be important enough to someone to be included in a will. My father has already passed. I'm guessing he left everything to my mother. My mother will probably leave everything to her new husband. I just want to be important. Story 45, Lance Corporal told to get a will before deployment. Young single idiot. 2 specific provisions concerning his death funeral. He wanted to be dressed in an Armani suit, and he wanted to be burned. Naturally, I inquired as to the latter. I said like a pyre. We didn't know what a pyre was after a pause. He says, I just had it in my mind. That idea, like be on the ground, just burning, you got it sparky. Story 46, used to be a paralegal, wrote up a trust for a couple who left an allocated amount of money to cover the wedding of each of their 3 daughters. With some very specific guidelines, the girl had to get married in the church the parents got married in. She had to be marrying a white Christian who has been male since birth. Prior to the marriage, they had to complete a reading list of 10 books on finance and relationships. They also both had to be college graduates without loans. I felt like typing that up. There was a bunch of other weird in that trust, but that's the part one remember most clearly. Story 47, it wasn't in the will itself, but one time I was helping a nice older lady out with her will, and I ended up uncovering that her nursing home was stealing from its patients. Story 48, not a lawyer, but a filthy rich old Australian lady who thought her children all were plotting to kill her left them each 30 pieces of silver and gave the rest away. Story 49 had a client leave their dog $5 million for the care and upkeep after the owner died, along with specific instructions that the dog was to eat 5 ounces of filet mignon every day. Her kid got $250K. Story 50, AM lawyer. You know how you hear those stories of parents leaving the kid one? It's not their spiteful sense of humor. Most times the parents really don't even want to leave the kid one, but it's a CYA strategy, so the kid can't contest the will and say they were left out in error. Story 51, my wife's grandmother died just over a year ago. Normally the money, about $500K, would be equally shared between her 2 daughters and her son. Unfortunately, one daughter died long ago, and the normal procedure is to give her 13 of the money to her husband, who constantly beat her up and is in general a drugged-up unemployed, and their kids who aren't much better. Since she didn't mention them in the will, we believe they're planning a contest. At the beginning of the year, the husband called up wanting to know where the TV, sound system, and lounge they purchased together 15 years ago ended up. Because I want him for me kids, and it don't cost anything to get legal aid on the case. So I thought, why not at the moment? The unmarried brother is on his last legs to liver failure, so it is very likely that they're just waiting for him to keel over so my mother-in-law can inherit his share, and they could try to grab half of $500K then, instead of 13. Of $500K, now, I'm not sure if that is how it works. Damn it. Mention even in your wills, people. Would have been nice to have been able to just leave him a 15-year-old Samsung CRT TV with no remote and the cover over the buttons broken off, if it wasn't chucked out 10 years ago. This one strange man handed me a sticky note on it was the man or animal who killed me gets everything I own or something along the lines of that. There was also some weird symbols on the bottom of it. Story 52, not a lawyer, but I knew this guy that inherited $300 million from a distant relative, but in order to get the money, he had to spend $30 million in just 30 days and couldn't tell anyone about it. Story 53, it never actually made it into the will, but a friend's grandmother wanted to leave her credit card debt to her creditor. Turns out you can't do that. Story 54, old lady client asked for clause direction to be included in her will for her cat to be euthanized following her death, as she felt that neither her husband, if he survived her, or anyone else would be able to look after the cat. The client died a few weeks ago. Her cat died of natural causes a few months earlier. Another client left his entire high-value estate to the crown, which people usually try to avoid, and rather leave it to charity if there is no one else they wish to benefit. He is still alive, so I may check whether he has changed his mind. Story 55. I once had to draft a will for one of my brother's clients. She was leaving custody of her 2 dogs to her boyfriend, provided that he could pass routine drug screenings in order to show fitness to raise the dogs. She had children from a previous relationship that were not mentioned in the will. Story 56. I work for an estate planning law firm. One client from long ago had in their will that one of their sons not be given anything from the estate, and a letter in the file explained, I'm summarizing here, that it's because the parents gave him handouts all the time. He was a deadbeat and left his wife and kids for a woman he met online and moved to Taiwan to be with her. Story 57. Not a lawyer, and I have no stories to contribute, but holy, I can't wait to write my will just as Schadenfreude, the ever-loving out of so many people. Story 58. I worked in a legal aid clinic in law school. We covered a few different specialties in the various clinics. The clinic that wrote wills was manned by this guy who at one point in time had been a brilliant lawyer and scholar, but had aged and wasn't always as sharp as he would have been. He also taught trust in estates for many years and had written the textbook. When you write a will, you typically specify which law applies, as in a clause saying this will is written under the state law of. We had a fake state named after one of our old deans that was frequently used in examples and test questions for class. Let's call it the state of Smith. In helping one of the other clinic students review an old will, we noticed a clause that it specified that the will should be interpreted according to the law of the state of Smith. The professor had been supervising these wills in hand, clearly read this, and never caught it. It was someone's actual will. Hopefully no one ever contests it, or that's going to be an awkward moment in probate court. Story 59. My grandpa's will was pretty shitty. I remember even the lawyer looked confused. Basically 300,000 several CDs with 50,000 each went to my uncle, his son that had abandoned him. He wasn't even at the will reading, and he's blown through the 300,000 in less than 10 years. My grandma, his wife, my mom, and his daughters got various objects of his, and he left a lot of money to some guys that we found out were his boyfriends. It was a really weird day. Story 60. There is, or at least was, a grant from a couple in Norway, which every year was given to the student of mechanical engineering who had the worst grades, but no failed exams. Story 61. Not a lawyer, but when my grandmother died on my mother's side, she left her inheritance split up between her 3 children. 1 million split between 3 children, so 500,000 for Teo and 10,000 for the last. See, my grandmother hated my mother, and this was her last act of you to her. We used the money to pay it forward a lot of places and donated a bunch to Siloam Mission. Story 62. Not a lawyer. My grandfather was alone after my grandmother died some years ago. Everyone in the family was convinced that he was loaded, despite him never using a dime on anything or anyone. He gave me 3 spoons from the dollar store when I turned 18, but we all knew that he owned some very expensive silverware, figurines, paintings, etc. My family is made up of greedy, self-absorbed asshats, and the old man too was a greedy, self-absorbed asshat, and a disgusting old pig to boot. Nobody liked him, including me, but I liked the rest of the family even less. Everybody except me kissed us all the time, waiting for him to die. At Christmas dinner when I was about 15, and as most teens, I loved my family off in every possible way. I asked him why he didn't sell all his stuff, moved to a warmer country, and found a nice lady friend he could spend his last days with. Not because I gave about his well-being, but because any place warm is at least 500 kilometers from my home country, and there by me. He proceeded to tell me that, quote, his didn't work that well anymore, end quote. So hot chicks was no longer a focus in his life, but he did enjoy it immensely when the nurse came every night and put Yuri sheath on his pecker. The rest of the family got pretty mad at me. Not because I unintentionally got the old pervert to talk about his at Christmas dinner, but because I had suggested that he use his own money to have some fun. About 10 years later, the old pervert finally died. The only place he moved was when the family finally got him into a nursing home, so that they didn't hate to take care of him. No warm place and no lady friend for Granny. They thought the money and all the expensive stuff was safe. Some years prior, I had told the family that it would make me more than happy if they would take a long walk on a very short jetty. So I don't know exactly what went down, but it was something like this. A short time after that memorable Christmas dinner, the old guy began to sell all his stuff to his drinking buddies, friends from the billiard club, and some other friends of his. The way he made the deal was that they could only get the stuff when he died, but in exchange, they got it dirt cheap. There was exactly nothing left for the family, except a load of old bills, magazines, and a couple of 1,000 sticky VHS tapes with Naughty Nurse Nina, the Nazi She Ilsa, and so on, plus all the other stuff he had hoarded the last 80 years. I still giggle when I think about it, and I hope that I had some part in his doing because of my suggestion at that Christmas dinner.